Japanese sentry stands guard in the Philippine jungle, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The night is still, too still. He hears nothing, not even the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. In one swift, silent motion, a blade pierces exactly 2 inches behind his earlobe, twists 90 degrees, and he crumples to the ground without uttering a single sound. By morning, his patrol will find him appearing to sleep peacefully at his post, except he'll never wake up again. This wasn't the work of a trained assassin or elite special forces operative. This was the signature kill of a 38-year-old Filipino schoolteacher who transformed herself into the most feared guerrilla commander in the Pacific Theater. A woman so deadly that the Japanese military placed a massive 10,000 peso bounty on her head. Her name was Nieves Fernandez, but enemy soldiers knew her by a different title, the Silent Killer. Armed with nothing but a farming knife and her bare hands, she personally eliminated over 200 Japanese soldiers, using a killing technique so precise that victims would lose consciousness before they could even gasp for air. She commanded 110 men, liberated entire villages, and turned the dense jungles of Leyte into a nightmare for occupying forces. How does a quiet educator become a legendary guerrilla commander whose very name struck terror into the hearts of hardened soldiers? Today, we're diving deep into the incredible true story of the schoolteacher who became World War II's most unlikely and lethal resistance leader, who saved her country and defied the Japanese Empire. When hell came to paradise. By the 1930s, the Empire of Japan had transformed from an isolated island nation into a military juggernaut. Their economy was booming, their navy was among the world's strongest, and their ambitions stretched far beyond their borders. Japan's vision was simple but terrifying: dominate all of East Asia under their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But there was one major problem standing in their way: the United States of America. The Philippines wasn't just any territory to the Americans. It was their crown jewel in the Pacific, a strategic fortress that controlled the sea lanes between Asia and the Americas. Since 1898, the U.S. had governed these 7,641 islands, and by 1935, they'd established the Philippine Commonwealth, a stepping stone toward promised independence. Tensions between Japan and America had been building for years. Japan's brutal invasion of China in 1937 horrified the Western world. The U.S. responded with economic sanctions, cutting off vital oil and steel supplies that Japan desperately needed for their war machine. For Japan, this was an act of war by economic means. They faced a terrible choice: back down and abandon their imperial dreams, or strike first before their military ran out of fuel. They chose to strike. December 7, 1941. 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. Japanese bombers screamed out of the morning sky and devastated Pearl Harbor. In just 2 hours, they crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,400 Americans and shocking the world. But here's what most people don't know. Pearl Harbor was just the opening move. While Americans reeled from the Hawaiian attack, Japan was simultaneously launching the largest coordinated military offensive in Pacific history. At dawn on December 8th, just 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, the people of Baguio in northern Luzon heard a sound that would haunt them forever: the drone of Japanese bombers. The attack was devastating and precise. Japanese planes struck Clark Airfield and destroyed most of the U.S. Far East Air Force while the planes were still on the ground. In a single morning, American air power in the Philippines was virtually eliminated. But the air raids were just the beginning. On December 10th, Japanese forces began landing on the beaches of northern Luzon. These weren't random attacks. This was a masterfully coordinated invasion involving over 43,000 troops, supported by naval bombardments and air superiority. The defending forces? A mixture of 31,000 American troops and 110,000 Filipino soldiers, many of them poorly equipped and undertrained. The odds were already stacked against them, but it got worse. Here's where the story takes a tragic turn. The Allied strategy was fatally flawed from the start. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding U.S. forces in the Philippines, had based his entire defense plan on a critical assumption: that massive reinforcements would arrive from the U.S. mainland within 6 months. But there was one enormous problem with this plan. Most of America's military resources were being shipped to Europe to fight Nazi Germany. The Philippines were essentially on their own. Meanwhile, the Japanese war machine was operating with ruthless efficiency. Their soldiers had been battle-hardened by years of fighting in China. Their equipment was modern and well-maintained. Most importantly, they had complete control of the seas around the Philippines, meaning no American reinforcements could get through. Despite fierce resistance from both American and Filipino forces, Japanese troops advanced with shocking speed. Manila, the crown jewel of the Philippines, fell on January 2, 1942, just 25 days after the invasion began. The capital of this American territory was now flying the Japanese flag. But the human cost was just beginning. In places like Tacloban on the island of Leyte, a peaceful coastal town that had never seen war, families watched in terror as Japanese soldiers marched through their streets. Local residents like the Fernandez family found their entire world transformed overnight from peaceful colonial life to brutal military occupation. Town after town fell: Cebu, Davao, Iloilo. Each victory brought the Japanese closer to total control. By May 1942, American and Filipino forces had surrendered, and the Japanese occupation began in earnest. The statistics of what followed are staggering and horrific. Historical records indicate that approximately 500,000 Filipino civilians died during the 3-year Japanese occupation. The Imperial Army implemented a reign of terror that included mass executions, forced labor, and the systematic kidnapping and molestation of women and girls. Thousands of Filipino women were forced into sexual slavery as comfort women for Japanese troops, taken directly from schools, markets, and their own homes. The Japanese military government issued brutal edicts. Anyone caught helping Allied forces would be executed. Entire villages could be burned for acts of resistance, and showing disrespect to Japanese soldiers was punishable by death. Public beheadings and mass shootings became common spectacles, designed to terrorize the population into complete submission. The last major resistance came from the Bataan Peninsula and the fortress island of Corregidor. Here, a combined force of American and Filipino troops made their final stand against impossible odds. For 4 months, these heroes held out despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and slowly starving. They had no air support, dwindling ammunition, and many were suffering from malaria and dysentery. But their courage couldn't overcome the mathematics of war. On April 9, 1942, Bataan fell. On May 6, Corregidor surrendered. The Philippines campaign was over. Japan had achieved total victory in just 142 days. The consequences were catastrophic. Over 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners were forced on the infamous Bataan Death March. A 65-mile journey of unspeakable brutality where thousands died. For the next 3 years, the Filipino people would endure one of the harshest occupations in World War II history. An estimated 1 million Filipino civilians would die during the Japanese occupation. But this story doesn't end in defeat. The fall of the Philippines marked the beginning of the largest guerrilla resistance movement in World War II. And in 1944, General MacArthur would return to fulfill his famous promise: "I shall return." Rise of the Silent Killer, Nieves Fernandez. Nieves Fernandez was born around 1906 in the tropical province of Leyte, in the heart of the Philippine Islands. Before the war transformed her world, she lived the quiet life of a rural educator and entrepreneur. After establishing herself as a respected schoolteacher in the provincial capital of Tacloban, Fernandez had built a modest wholesale business that served the local community. She was known as a sharp-minded woman who could handle both the classroom and the marketplace with equal skill. Fernandez's daily concerns revolved around lesson plans, business ledgers, and the welfare of her students. She was particularly protective of her female pupils, seeing education as their pathway to independence in a traditional society. Nieves Fernandez found herself facing an impossible choice. Japanese forces had established a garrison in her town, and soldiers regularly patrolled the streets, eyeing young women with predatory intent. Several of her former students had already disappeared, likely taken to serve as comfort women in distant military camps. The breaking point came when Japanese soldiers began conducting inspections at the local school. Fernandez watched in horror as uniformed men leered at her teenage female students, making crude comments and occasionally dragging girls away for questioning, from which some never returned. The teacher in her recognized the signs of a systematic hunting ground being established, and she knew that soon it would be her turn to watch helplessly as her students were taken. But Nieves Fernandez was not a woman who accepted helplessness. When the Japanese came, she would later tell American officers, "No one could keep anything. They took everything they wanted." But what they didn't realize was that they were taking from someone who would not remain a victim. Fernandez began quietly reaching out to men in the surrounding villages, farmers, fishermen, laborers who had seen their livelihoods destroyed and their families threatened. She discovered that across Leyte, small pockets of resistance were already forming, groups of desperate people with little coordination and even fewer weapons. Most resistance cells suffered from critical shortages. They lacked military training, proper weapons, ammunition, and most importantly, experienced leadership. What they did have was intimate knowledge of the jungle terrain, burning hatred for their occupiers, and nothing left to lose. Fernandez realized that her teaching skills, her ability to organize, instruct, and inspire, could be exactly what these scattered groups needed. She began secretly recruiting men who were willing to fight, eventually assembling a core group of loyal followers who would become her guerrilla unit. The transformation from schoolteacher to guerrilla commander didn't happen overnight. Fernandez understood that conventional warfare was impossible. They had no heavy weapons, no artillery, no air support. But she also recognized that they had advantages the Japanese didn't. They knew every trail, every cave, every hiding spot in the dense jungle terrain of Leyte. They could move like ghosts through territory that was alien to their enemies. How a farm tool became a weapon of terror. Fernandez proved to be a natural military strategist, but her greatest innovation came in the realm of silent warfare. She understood that guerrilla success depended not on dramatic battles, but on creating an atmosphere of constant fear and uncertainty among enemy forces. To achieve this, she would need to master the art of killing without detection. The weapon she chose was deceptively simple, the traditional Filipino bolo knife. This curved blade, typically used for cutting vegetation and farming work, was available everywhere and aroused no suspicion when carried by rural Filipinos. But in Fernandez's hands, the humble farming tool became an instrument of surgical precision. She spent weeks studying anatomy, learning the exact location of major arteries and nerve centers. Through careful observation and experimentation, she developed what would become her signature killing technique, a method so efficient and silent that victims would lose consciousness before they could raise an alarm. Fernandez's approach was methodical and terrifying in its precision. She would dress entirely in black, a simple black dress that allowed her to blend into shadows, and fight completely barefoot to eliminate any sound of footsteps. Moving with the silence of a hunting cat, she would approach sentries and isolated soldiers from behind, timing her movements to coincide with natural jungle sounds that would mask any slight noise. Her killing technique targeted a specific point just behind and below the earlobe, where the carotid artery and internal jugular vein run close to the surface. Using the sharp tip of her bolo, she would pierce exactly 2 inches into this vulnerable spot, then twist the blade up to 90 degrees. This motion severed both major blood vessels simultaneously, causing immediate unconsciousness as blood flow to the brain was cut off. The technique was devastatingly effective for several reasons. First, the cut meant that even if the victim tried to scream, their vocal cords would be paralyzed by the trauma. The only sound would be a brief gurgling or choking noise that could easily be mistaken for someone clearing their throat. Most importantly, death followed quickly but not instantly, giving Fernandez time to lower the body silently to the ground and retreat before the victim's absence was noticed. Japanese patrols would find their comrades apparently asleep at their posts, only discovering the truth when they tried to wake them and found them cold and lifeless. Word of these mysterious deaths began to spread through Japanese ranks like wildfire. Soldiers would be found at their posts with what appeared to be tiny puncture wounds, but medical examinations revealed the devastating internal damage. The precision required for such kills suggested a level of anatomical knowledge and combat skill that seemed impossible for untrained Filipino civilians. Fernandez didn't limit herself to solo operations. She trained her growing band of guerrillas in similar stealth techniques, though few could match her surgical precision. She taught them to make improvised weapons from materials readily available in rural areas. Shotguns constructed from sections of gas pipe, loaded with gunpowder and rusty nails that created devastating close-range weapons. Her men learned to craft crude but effective grenades using available explosives and metal fragments. The Untouchable Guerrilla. As news of the silent killing spread, Japanese forces began to realize they were facing something far more dangerous than typical guerrilla harassment. The psychological impact of finding dead soldiers with no apparent cause of death was devastating to morale. Sentries began abandoning their posts, patrols started moving in larger groups, and sleep became difficult for Japanese troops who knew that death could approach silently in the darkness. The Japanese military command initially struggled to understand what they were facing. Early reports described the deaths as possible disease outbreaks or poisoning attempts. It took weeks before they realized they were dealing with a skilled assassin who was systematically eliminating their personnel with surgical precision. Intelligence reports eventually identified Fernandez as the leader of the most effective resistance cell in Leyte. Japanese commanders were reportedly shocked to learn that their most feared enemy was a former schoolteacher who had never received formal military training. In response, they placed an enormous bounty of 10,000 Philippine pesos on her head, equivalent to several years' salary for most Filipinos at the time. Over the course of 2.5 years, Fernandez's guerrilla unit grew from a handful of desperate villagers to a disciplined force of 110 fighters. Operating primarily in the jungle regions around Tacloban, her forces conducted dozens of successful ambushes against Japanese patrols, supply convoys, and isolated outposts. The documented statistics of their success are remarkable. Official military records credit Fernandez's unit with killing more than 200 Japanese soldiers during the occupation period. Beyond the direct casualties, her operations disrupted enemy supply lines, gathered crucial intelligence for Allied forces, and liberated numerous villages from Japanese control. Perhaps most importantly, Fernandez's fighters rescued dozens of Filipino women who had been taken as comfort women. These dangerous rescue operations required infiltrating heavily guarded compounds and safely evacuating traumatized victims through hostile territory. Many of these women credited Fernandez with saving their lives and preserving their dignity in the face of systematic sexual violence. The impact of these operations extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. Word of the female guerrilla commander who could kill silently spread throughout the Philippines, inspiring other resistance groups and providing hope to civilian populations living under brutal occupation. Fernandez became a symbol of Filipino resilience and the possibility that even ordinary people could strike back against seemingly overwhelming odds. Japanese forces attempted numerous operations to capture or eliminate Fernandez, but her intimate knowledge of local terrain and the loyalty of the civilian population made her nearly impossible to track. She moved constantly between safe houses, never staying in one location for more than a few days, and maintained a network of informants who provided early warning of enemy movements. Historical validation. The extraordinary claims about Fernandez's wartime activities might seem too incredible to believe, but extensive documentation from multiple sources confirms the reality of her achievements. When American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944 to begin the liberation of the Philippines, they found a resistance network that had already freed large portions of the island from Japanese control. U.S. Army intelligence officers were amazed to discover that one of the most effective guerrilla commanders was a soft-spoken former schoolteacher who appeared more suited to a classroom than a battlefield. Captain Donald Blackburn, who worked extensively with Filipino resistance groups, later wrote in his official reports about the remarkable woman who commanded absolute loyalty from her men and had developed killing techniques that surpassed anything taught in military schools. The most detailed contemporary account appeared in a military correspondence dispatch filed shortly after the American landing. The reporter described meeting Fernandez in person. A prim former schoolteacher, so far as known here the only woman to fight 2.5 years with Filipino guerrillas, told Today how she commanded 110 natives who killed 200 Japanese with shotguns made from sections of gas pipes. The article continued with Fernandez's own words. "That was when they called me Captain Nieves Fernandez," she said. "Now I'm just Miss Fernandez." The reporter noted her modest appearance. Paler than most native women of this section, her first name, Nieves, is the Spanish word for snows. Miss Fernandez was without shoes and was attired in a plain black frock as she conferred with American officers. She is 38 years old at present. During this interview, Fernandez demonstrated her killing technique to fascinated American officers. Photographs from this demonstration show her explaining the precise angle and depth required for her signature attack, using a captured Japanese soldier's helmet to illustrate the anatomical target points. These images, preserved in U.S. military archives, provide visual confirmation of her methods. The interview revealed additional details about her operations. Working with guerrillas south of Tacloban, Miss Fernandez rounded up native men to resist the Japanese. These men, she said, had 3 American rifles. The rest they made themselves out of gas pipe. They loaded them with gunpowder and old nails. They also made grenades, and sometimes they got hold of Japanese weapons. U.S. intelligence officers confirmed the Japanese bounty on her head, noting that the Japanese offered 10,000 pesos for her head. They also documented that she was wounded once. There is a bullet scar on her right forearm, evidence of her direct participation in combat operations. Military records show that Fernandez's unit was officially recognized by the U.S. Army and incorporated into the regular Filipino forces during the final months of the war. Her men received back pay and recognition for their service, while she herself was honored as one of the most effective resistance commanders in the Pacific Theater. Nieves Fernandez was more than a schoolteacher. She was a beacon of resistance, a woman who turned her love for her students into a fierce fight for her homeland. Her story reminds us that courage can emerge from the most unassuming places, transforming ordinary lives into legacies of heroism. In the face of oppression, she showed that one person's resolve could spark a movement, toppling empires with nothing more than a bolo and an unbreakable spirit. Today, she is remembered as the silent killer of Tacloban, a symbol of defiance whose actions helped free a nation.